When NAFTA was negotiated, it started in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney in Canada, and ultimately was resolved with George Bush Sr. In the 1990s. A lot of the idea of that was to bring down prices for North American manufacturers so they would be competitive on the international market. And they looked at manufacturing in Canada and they looked at manufacturing in the United States, and they knew that it was going to affect certain sectors of manufacturing. And they said to themselves, well, we don't have to be processing all of this product necessarily in Canada. We can extract some of it in Canada. They'll be processing in the United States. We'll be buying it back in Canada. We'll be manufacturing in Canada. They'll be manufacturing in the United States. And a lot of it was with the sole intention of making sure that we in North America are competitive, that we can keep our prices down to compete on the global market. And it was recognizing the already significant integration that we had between our economy, Canada and the US, and Mexico as well. And of course there was concerns because, washers and dryers were maybe no longer going to be made in Ontario, or eventually maybe no longer made in the United States and then manufactured in Mexico. And this was an issue, obviously, and everybody wants to protect their small local industry. But it was recognized that the greater good was to rationalize some of these things and to recognize that we needed to get prices down to compete internationally. Now, what has happened to the manufacture of a lot of these products? They moved to China, some of them to Korea. We've been competing, having NAFTA, and trying to keep prices down as well as possible. But it led to people being dissatisfaction. Obviously, this was something that Trump was able to use to his benefit to persuade people that this was a problem, when really we're just competing with the rest of the world. And the result is, of course, now instead of having NAFTA, he renegotiated that. Now he's not happy with that. The only thing that he, in fact, negotiated, he says is defective, and says that the U.S. is being taken advantage of. Not the case. The whole idea was to try and keep prices down overall. And so, for example, if you can buy cheap aluminum ingots from Canada because we can produce the raw aluminum, then they could process it and make it into sheets of aluminum in the United States to be used in aircraft manufacturing in Canada and the US, for example. That was the idea, right? That was the idea. And it makes a lot of sense. Free trade makes a lot of sense. It hurts people in the short term. But what happens when you have tariffs? You do the exact opposite. You turn your products into something more expensive that it can no longer compete on the international market. And think of aluminum, okay? 25% tariff on aluminum. Boeing has to buy that aluminum. That aluminum can be made in the United States, costs a little bit more money. It can be made in Canada. They've got a 25% tariff on it if it's coming from Canada. Boeing will pay more for aluminum, and people will pay more for aluminum cans and things like that. Well, Boeing's competing with Airbus, and Airbus can buy our aluminum from Canada without tariffs. And you're looking at a Boeing aircraft, it might be 10% more as a result of the increased price of aluminum that Boeing has to pay. Does that make the U.S. more competitive? I don't think so. I don't think it helps them on the international stage. I don't think it helps them in any way. And in the short term, it might be politics to identify somebody else and use them for the purpose of stirring up hatred or whatever, which is, of course, what Trump's doing. But in the long term, it's just going to weaken U.S. industries. And I'll be surprised if Boeing can survive. And we've seen this huge number of mergers of airline manufacturers over the years, of aircraft manufacturers, and the last two ones really left standing in are Boeing and Airbus. And of course we've got Bombardier in Canada, and China's now producing them, but really, are they going to be able to survive, Boeing as a viable company, if they're competing with Airbus and Airbus isn't facing those tariffs?